Hey all! It's been a whole week since the 20th anniversary patch went live, and in light of the buffs and changes Mistweaver Monk has received, now feels like the right time for a more thorough look at casting Mistweaver. For anyone new to the spec, I'll be covering our basic priorities, how our main talents and abilities work together, and what our healing looks like, at least moment to moment, in terms of rotation and ramps. I'll also be talking about how the 11.0.5 changes affect the talents I recommend, since this is the first time in a long time that we have multiple viable options within the caster build. I've included timestamps in case you don't care to hear my reinterpretation of the basics, and please feel free to leave a comment below if you think I've explained something poorly, and I'll do the best I can to clarify. Starting with stats, haste is our first priority, then crit, then verse. I avoid mastery altogether if I can manage it, and I typically shoot for between 20 and 30% haste, since anything under 20 feels sluggish, and pushing my haste even higher means I can afford to wear the odd crit verse piece without messing up my overall stats. It's worth mentioning that crit is important for two major reasons. First, for every 250,000 mana we spend, we get one stack of mana tea. And every time we gain a stack, we have a chance equal to our crit chance of gaining an additional stack. Second, whenever Vivify crits, even through the Invigorating Mists talent, we get a small cooldown reduction on revival, which really starts to add up and can lead to an entire extra usage by the end of an encounter. The core of the spec revolves around first cycling our 2 charges of Renewing Mist, which are smaller 20-second hots, then ramping with Enveloping Mist, a bigger hot that also increases healing taken for 7 seconds, and finally pushing as much healing as possible with our Direct Heal Vivify during small windows, prioritizing injured players with healing amplifiers on them to do even more healing. Thanks to the talent Peer into Peace, casting Mistweavers can ramp as much as we want, whenever we want, as long as our mana permits it. The more comfortable we are at pacing our spending and our regen, the more often we can heal aggressively and spend recklessly. Our first general priority is maintaining our smallest heal over time, Renewing Mist, which comes with 2 charges. We don't want these to go to waste, and while these jump automatically to new targets whenever there's nothing left to heal, the talent Chi Harmony does make it important who we put these on initially. The way this talent works is that our casts of Renewing Mist apply Chi Harmony to the initial target, giving them an 8-second buff that increases all of our healing done to them by 50%. Especially in dungeons, this is a pretty crucial thing to tank healing and triage. And since the updated icon for Chi Harmony is the same color as basically half our toolkit, I'd highly recommend finding a weak aura or some other way to track it that works for you. Before I talk about the way our ramp works, I'll need to mention Rapid Diffusion, a talent that makes it so that any time we cast Enveloping Mist or Rising Sun Kick, a 6-second Renewing Mist gets put on a random player. This doesn't mean you have to make Rising Sun Kick a part of your rotation, it's just a way the talent supports both Mistweaver playstyles. When we ramp, and during our burst windows, these extra Renewing Mists from Rapid Diffusion allow us to achieve around half a dozen Renewing Mists active simultaneously for a few seconds at a time, which is plenty long enough to do a few seconds of powerful cleave healing through Vivify. When I say cleave healing, I'm talking about the healing done by the talent Invigorating Mists. Whenever we cast Vivify, it heals the initial target, but it also heals any players with Renewing Mist for a small amount. Next, I want to talk about Soothing Mist and what we do to ramp. Channeling Soothing Mist on someone does a small amount of healing, but while we channel, both Enveloping Mist and Vivify are both instant casts. And the talent Peer into Peace, which I mentioned before, makes it so that the channel automatically moves to the latest target of these spells, without requiring us to start a fresh Soothing Mist every time we want to heal someone new. For the most part, we only have to recast Soothing Mist every 8 or so seconds, depending on our haste, and we only break our channel to reapply Renewing Mists, move, or hit our other abilities. Speaking of movement, we've got a few ways to heal on the move, not including our major cooldowns. First is the talent Vivacious Vivification, which gives us an instant 20% stronger Vivify every 10 seconds. This is definitely something you might want a weak aura to track, that way you know how long you have to spend your proc before it's overwritten by the next one. Second is Thunder Focus Tea, which empowers the next spell we cast from a short list. If we cast Thunder Focus Tea, then hit Enveloping Mist to empower it, That Enveloping Mist, in addition to its usual effects, is instant and heals for an additional large amount right away. So if you can't stop running long enough to start your ramp on someone, you can always hit them with Renewing Mist to trigger Chi Harmony, then drink Thunder Focus Tea and hit them with an empowered instant Enveloping Mist, and finally hit them with your next instant Vivify proc, which should benefit from both of those amplifiers and do a ton of healing. Before I move on from talking about Thunder Focus Tea, I want to mention two things. First, if you don't need to save it to make an instant Enveloping Mist, go ahead and use it whenever you want with Renewing Mist. Adding an extra 10 seconds to its duration never hurts. Second, the talent Secret Infusion rewards us with 15% of a secondary stat after we cast a spell empowered by Thunder Focus Tea. That's haste for empowering a Renewing Mist, and crit for empowering an Enveloping Mist. This is something worth remembering before a ramp, or before hitting a major healing CD. In terms of what we actually do to heal, when we're not putting out Renewing Mists, we generally want to channel Soothing Mist on the tank or someone equally likely to take damage, and then heal with our Enveloping Mist and Vivify as much as needed, recasting Soothing Mist whenever it's about to run out. By doing this, we're just about always in a position to start our ramp, but we tailor the shape of that ramp to the way damage comes in. I try to cast Enveloping Mist pretty often, even if the healing isn't absolutely necessary, since it procs Rapid Diffusion and gives me a bit of extra coverage, so I am ready to start pushing Vivify if the damage comes in. In Dawnbreaker, just before the bad overlap on the second boss, you can see I'm sort of haphazardly spreading my Renewing and Enveloping Mists. That's the way I've got Renewing Mist and at least one amplifier on most, and in this case, all of my group. And I cast 2 more Enveloping Mist just as damage starts, that way they'll be up for the rest of the ramp, and then I cast Vivify a full 5 times until the damage stops. It's not always like this. Sometimes I'll start the ramp with more Enveloping Mists, or I'll end with fewer Vivifies, or I'll split the peak of my ramp between 2 channels of Soothing Mist, though it's smoother if it fits into one, but that requires you to time it pretty well. I don't always time my ramps down to the second, but I'll use this weak aura to track how many Renewing Mists I have active. That way I can tell at just a glance how my Renewing Mist coverage looks, if I've made myself a small window to push healing with Vivify for a few seconds, and how long I can do that push before those hots start to run out and force me to start rebuilding. I want to briefly explain how a few of our major healing CDs fit into this ramp-centric playstyle, and hopefully after that I can segue into talking about hero talents. Invoke Yu'lon makes our ramp more effective for a short time, reducing the cost of Enveloping Mist for the duration, and if we're talented into Invoker's Delight, it also gives us a mini Lust, 20% haste, for the first 8 seconds. This assumes we're taking Gift of the Celestials, which lowers Yu'lon's cooldown to 1 minute at the cost of making it last only 12 seconds. The whole time Yu'lon is active, whenever we cast Enveloping Mist, our dragon breathes on players around the target, giving them another small healing amplifier. On top of that, invoking Yu'lon also gives a few players a small and noticeable damage absorb when we initially cast it. Revival is just a raid-wide heal and dispel that does a decent amount, especially if we can ramp a bit beforehand. We can swap this out for Restoral on fights where a magic dispel at the wrong time can have unintended consequences, like Olgrax, Broodtwister, and Silken Cord. Life Cocoon is mostly self-explanatory, but I want to point out that it's really good in Narubar Palace, since bosses like Sikran, Rashanan, and Kaiveza have tank busters so powerful that we can regularly get the full value out of each cocoon. Broodtwister's Volatile Concoction and Queen Ansarek's Feast are also great places to use it, but I won't go into detail on those. Sheilun's Gift is a targeted heal that gains a stack, or a cloud, every 8 seconds when we're in combat, up to 10 stacks. The higher the stacks, the more it heals for, and while it also heals 2 other players for the same amount that it heals the initial target, we don't control who those 2 targets are, and I've found that it often picks players who don't need any healing, making it wildly unreliable. But the talents below Sheilun's Gift modify it in very important ways. In my raid builds, I pick Xiaohao's Lessons, treating Sheilun less as a heal and more of a personal buff. When we cast it, we get 1 of 4 possible buffs, all of which are generally useful and don't really change our gameplay. This lasts up to 30 seconds depending on how many stacks we had when we used it. Ideally, I cast it with around 5 stacks just before a ramp so that it amplifies my healing, but if I can't really devote enough attention to micromanage it, hitting it whenever it's at 10 stacks still gives us plenty of uptime. In my dungeon builds, Sheilun's Gift is a majorly flexible healing cooldown, especially if I've set up my amplifiers beforehand. With the talents Veil of Pride and Legacy of Wisdom, Sheilun's Gift accumulates stacks twice as fast, it casts faster, and it hits an additional 2 targets. In a 5-man group, that means it heals everyone for the same amount, making it reliable in a way that the 3-target version just isn't. Sometimes, instead of spamming Vivify at the end of a ramp, I'll cast Sheilun instead, which is generally cheaper too. At other times, I'll make sure it lands just after a large group hit, or I'll hit it if I don't have enough time to ramp and do setup. In most cases, I don't even need to wait for the full 10 stacks, as long as it has enough to do the healing that it needs to. Now, I won't go into too much detail about our hero talents, but I 100% recommend Conduit of the Celestials, which gives us a major healing CD and a bunch of passive procs and buffs that enhance but don't really alter our gameplay. The Master of Harmony tree, which I do not recommend, changes our gameplay by creating new windows of increased healing after every cast of Thunder Focus Tea. Several of its passives depend on melee attacks, which I don't really do, and Mastery, which, like I said, I avoid. So while it's my opinion that this requires too much tracking and micromanaging to be worth the benefit, and while I think it is slightly more geared towards fist weaving, I know some Mistweavers prefer something more interactive, which I can totally understand. The main reason I prefer Conduit of the Celestials is because Celestial Conduit is the ideal healing cooldown. It does massive healing that prioritizes injured players. It gives a moderate absorb shield to a few players when it's cast. And it allows us to use movement spells like Tiger's Lust and Roll without interrupting its channel. If you can remember when we used to have Essence Font, it's basically that, but better in every way. Now I want to talk about actual talent builds, starting with 3 builds that I think work well in raid content. These are all variations on the popular Tear of Morning build, which has become pretty much synonymous with the casting playstyle. My first build is a pure healing setup. There's Uplifted Spirits for the cooldown reduction on Revival every time Vivify crits. There's Xiaohao's Lessons to turn Sheilun's Gift into a personal buff. Calming Coalescence and Chrysalis for a stronger, more frequently available Life Cocoon. And Unison for a little trickle of smart healing as long as we're channeling Soothing Mist. Since I tend to raid with a larger group, I pretty much never use my second build, but I'll mention it next since it's only a slight modification on the first. By dropping Unison, which only makes up 1 to 1.5% of my healing in most fights, this second build takes Legacy of Wisdom, since a 5-target heal covers an entire half of a 10-man raid. This would also open up the option of taking Veil of Pride instead of Xiaohao's Lessons, depending on how often we have the opportunity to get the full value out of Sheilun's healing, versus the buffs we get from Lessons. Both are pretty viable. But like I said, I would only recommend this for much smaller raid groups, and if you're comfortable playing with Sheilun's Gift in a raid setting. My last raid build is very new, since it uses talents we got in the 20th anniversary patch. It's also a slight modification on the first, dropping Unison but also giving up either Chrysalis or Uplifted Spirits, whichever one feels less important. This build takes Jadefire Teachings and Jade Empowerment, and these give us access to a group heal through Thunder Focus Tea and Crackling Jade Lightning, as long as there are multiple enemies gathered together at the same time that lots of group healing is needed. Then there are my 2 dungeon builds. My first build isn't the one I'm using currently, but it's beginner-friendly and purely focused on healing. With this build, I take Mending Proliferation, which gives every tick of Enveloping Mist a 50% chance to duplicate its 40% healing amplifier onto another injured player. Since I'm constantly using Enveloping Mist, this means it's constantly proccing, so I've got a lot of extra coverage with these amplifiers that I wouldn't have otherwise, keeping me in a better position to push healing when I need to, and sometimes saving the day if I fall behind on spreading my buffs. Not to mention, it's extremely satisfying when Mending Proliferation procs on someone who's already got our other amplifiers, since all these bonuses stack. The only downside of this talent is that it snapshots the remaining duration of the Enveloping Mist that procs it. So if it procs on the last tick of an Enveloping Mist, The new amplifier is going to show up with 1 second remaining, which just isn't enough time to take advantage of it. But it usually lands more in the middle, so don't let me put you off from trying it. My other build, which is the one I'm using currently, is a lightning build, taking Jadefire Teachings and Jade Empowerment while giving up Invoker's Delight and Mending Proliferation. This means no more mini-lust during the first 8 seconds of Yu'lon, and no extra amplifiers to smooth out my mistakes. On the bright side, it gives me access to massive multi-target damage that I wouldn't have otherwise, and as long as I use my lightning procs while Jadefire Teachings is active, that's for 15 seconds after casting Thunder Focus Tea, it'll heal injured players for a large portion of the damage it deals. The buff from Jade Empowerment doesn't have a duration, and it stacks to 2, so it's very flexible to use. So I've actually got one more dungeon build, but it's just a modification on my lightning build. Instead of Jadefire Teachings, this build takes Rushing Wind Kick, replacing Rising Sun Kick with an alternative that strikes at a 25-yard cone, does increased damage when it hits multiple targets, and splits its damage across targets hit. The best part? It doesn't require a target, so it takes even less effort to hit it during downtime. The downside of this build, compared to the other, is that even though it gives us an additional way to do damage and contribute, less of that damage gets converted into healing, since all we get is the baseline version of Ancient Teachings. When it comes to improving as a casting Mistweaver, it helps to become more instinctively familiar with how much mana you can afford to spend, and how much or how often you'll regenerate it through Mana Tea. Speaking of Mana Tea, consuming all of our stacks at once is fine, but it's better if we consume only what we need for what comes after. If we're about to go into a ramp, but have a few seconds of downtime, consuming, let's say, 10 stacks, will give us the discount we need at a time when we spend the most, and we can save the rest for later. Another thing we can do to improve is tracking our amplifiers and picking our targets better, especially with our instant Vivify procs. If 3 injured players all have healing amplifiers, but one has 2 amplifiers, healing any of them is a good option, but healing the one with 2 is better. The last thing isn't exactly an improvement, but more of an obnoxious trick that we can take advantage of at the start of a raid encounter. If there's time between pulls, we can build up 20 stacks of Mana Tea and consume them. That way we carry the discount into the fight for the first 15 seconds or so. They've made this a bit harder to do since Dragonflight, since the buff from Mana Tea has to be on you before combat begins if you want to keep it. If you're still channeling when the fight starts, the buff from Mana Tea disappears instantly, but if you finish channeling 1 or 2 seconds before the pull, it stays. Assuming your group does a 10-second countdown before pulls, I've found it safest to start channeling at around 7 seconds. Again, this really isn't necessary for most fights, but it does make a difference in fights where we typically start spending and ramping in the first 15 seconds. If you want some examples, Ulgrax casts his Venomous Spray 6 seconds into the fight, Rashanon casts Erosive Spray at 9 seconds, and Queen Ansarek casts Liquefy at 9 seconds. Just don't expect to have much downtime between pulls if you do want to try this, since it does take a while to build 20 stacks between each pull. On the bright side, we do keep any stacks we have after a wipe, which gives us a bit of a head start prepping for the next pull. So that's my interpretation of casting Mistweaver as of patch 11.0.5. I didn't mean for this video to run so long, but I really wanted to cover enough to answer the common questions I get, and to be a useful resource to anyone who's just starting out. Like I said before, I'd love to hear if you think I left something out or explained something poorly. I'm happy to answer any questions or clear up any confusion I might have created. If you're new to my channel, I mostly post videos of casting Mistweaver gameplay, so if that's something you're interested in, then you might be in the right place. I know the way I have my UI set up is enough to make some people cringe, but if you want to take some of my weak auras and twist them into something that works better for you, I've added a link to the pack I use in the description below. Just be sure to disable the ones you don't want. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.